various measures taken by EU member states, stronger growth isn't expected in 2025. So let's review 2024 and look ahead to 2025 with our panel of experts. We're joined from London by Bilal Hafeez, founder and CEO of Macro Hive. From Singapore, we're joined by Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at Heinrich. That's an organization, the Heinrich Foundation, which is an organization specializing in trade research. And from London, Ian Goldin, a professor of globalization and development at Oxford University. Welcome to you all. Bilal, it felt like a wild roller coaster at times, but what sort of year was 2024 economically? Was it good, bad, or perfectly average?
Well, you're absolutely right. It was a roller coaster year. Overall, it depends who you ask, but given that stocks were up overall, given the fact that inflation was falling, growth in general, especially in the US, was strong, I would say that 2024 on balance was very, very good, especially given some of the geopolitics that we saw over the course of the year.
And is the war against inflation won? 2024 will be remembered by many people around the world, of course, for the high cost of living. We were all finding it a bit hard to meet our bills. Are we likely to see further interest rate cuts in 2025? Are prices likely to fall, or at least not grow as quickly?
Well, personally, I don't think the inflation dragon has been slain. While inflation has fallen over the course of 2024, I think it will remain sticky over the course of 2025. Now, many central banks will continue to cut rates, and I do think that that's in some ways they're being behind the curve and thinking that they remain in the old paradigm of low inflation. So my bias is that inflation will be sticky or stickier in 2025, and that many central banks will end up not cutting as much as many people expect at the moment.
Deborah, 2024 was a troubling year, in particular for China's economy. We've got the threat of deflation there. What's gone wrong? And has the government done enough, do you think, to get China's economy back on track?
The second question is easier to answer, which is no, they haven't quite done enough, partly because the scale of the problem has been quite significant. I mean, they have taken steps in 2024 to deal with a declining domestic market, particularly around property prices, in which so many average citizens in China have invested in property, and trying to sort that out has consumed a lot of time and effort internally within China. But I think if you look outside of China, actually 2024 has been relatively good economic growth, especially for the rest of the region, given the extent of turmoil that we've had in other locations. I mean, inflation, yes, is a problem, but it's not quite as central, I think, to many of the economies across Asia as it has been for others. And so I think overall, relatively decent amounts of economic growth, especially given the turbulence elsewhere.
Ian, what's your view on 2024? How much damage have the ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine, the geopolitical risks, the continuing tension done to our interlinked economies? Just how bad was 2024 in your view?
I think 2024 has been surprisingly good, not least in Asia, where we've had average growth rates of over 5%. Even China, people talk of a crisis, 5% growth. We've never achieved that in Europe or the US on a sustained basis. So, that sort of crisis ain't too bad if you're in Europe or in the US. Clearly big overhangs. I think globalization is under threat. It's alive and well and moving to Asia, but certainly across the Atlantic, I think it's under threat. And the wars in Gaza and Israel and in Ukraine are certainly undermining it. So we are seeing a real threat, but I think the real challenge is going to come in 2025 when we discover whether President Trump does what he says he's going to do, which is start a tariff war. And that would be very serious. I think the expulsion of undocumented workers in the US would also slow the US economy down dramatically. So if the US does what President Trump says he's going to do, I think we're going to have a much more difficult 2025.
And Ian, what would a tariff war, a trade war, actually look and feel like for the rest of us?
Well, I think it would be very targeted. I think there'd be retaliation. So I think we're really going backwards in terms of what's been achieved over the last 40 years, in terms of lowering tariffs, a relatively open trade system. It would be particularly bad, I think, for European countries. I think it would be bad for some Asian countries, and lower income countries like those in Africa, I think would be particularly disadvantaged. So it'll be nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring. These things, I think, will make trade much more political and reinforce many of the negative tendencies that we've seen at times in the past. So it'll make it a very, very difficult for global companies. This will be particularly challenging because how do you organize your supply chains? How do you ensure that your business thrives globally when parts of your business are being isolated through politics?
Bilal, do you agree with that? And will Trump, do you think, impose tariffs? Will he start trade wars as soon as he comes into office?
Well, I think certainly some form of trade wars and some kind of imposition of tariffs he will try to engage in. The larger question is something he did talk about in his campaign trail was introducing a universal tariff against all countries, whether that's a 5% or 10% tariff. And that's a change from what he did the last time he was in office, where it was more like bilateral trade wars, with China or with Mexico and so on. So if he was to introduce this universal tariff against all countries, then that would be very, very negative overall. So that's, for me, the big thing. Is he going to do that? My base case is instead he will use tariffs as a weapon against countries, to try to get advantageous trade deals with different countries around the world, which does introduce uncertainty, as Ian mentioned. But the biggest risk would be if we were to see universal tariffs, which would take us back to what we saw in 1930 when we had the Smoot-Hawley Act, which coincided with the Great Depression.
Deborah, what would that mean for China's economy in particular, as precarious as it currently is?
Well, I think if the tariffs were truly universal, actually the damage would be relatively modest, unless you're in the United States, at which point everything suddenly became significantly more expensive. But if it was universal and if it was even, then basically everyone else is on the same playing field entering the U.S. market. So I don't think that that's the problem. But I think the challenge is that it's unlikely to be a universal policy, which means that there will be opportunities for adjustments depending on country or market or product or even company itself. And so that unevenness of application, I think, is very damaging and creates all kinds of challenges for the rest of the world, who will have to navigate increasing complexity, increasing difficulty in doing trade. And once you've declared that this is an acceptable use of tariffs or an acceptable use of trade policy, then you also give license to others to do something similar, i.e., we've basically taken the rule book of the last 70 plus years, thrown it out the window and said, do whatever you would like. It's the sort of law of the jungle. And I think that is extremely damaging to all of us, especially for Asia, which is very export dependent. So if you're export driven and exports are becoming increasingly difficult, compliance costs are through the roof. That is really going to put some pressure on economic growth into 2025.
Deborah, we'll talk about the EU in a few minutes, which of course has got its own problems. But if Trump does what you think he might do, or what we all think he might do, he's threatened to do it. Why wouldn't he carry through with it? If he starts some sort of tariff war, would China be forced, perhaps, do you think, to make friends, at least economically speaking, more with Europe?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think there are so many challenges we have with an incoming Trump administration, but one of them that I think I see over and over again in the last few weeks is difficulties individuals have in imagining an alternative universe that we're about to enter. And so you would have said, if I'd asked you a year ago or something, are China and Europe going to become best friends? You would have said, of course not. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen in 2025, but my point is that there are now options on the table as we head into 2025 and beyond that I think would have been challenging to imagine even just a very short time ago. And so I think certainly within Europe, there is a rethink happening on their relationships with the United States, relationships within Europe with each other, also relationships with China. And there is a lot of cross tensions between those, especially European economies that are tightly dependent on China, those which are less dependent on China, those which have to think very hard about what does the bloc do as a group, what do they do as individual countries. There are a lot of complexities that are going to create a lot of challenges for officials, certainly, and also for companies heading into 2025 when the rules are changing so quickly.
Ian, as Deborah said, the result of a tariff war could be that the only people feeling the pain, the real pain, could be American consumers who'll suddenly find that they're paying a lot more for goods. How damaging could President Trump's threatened tariff war be for the American economy?
I think it could be very damaging indeed. I think we're likely to see inflation go up, therefore interest rates go up, growth slow. It'll aggravate many of the inequalities in the US. And I think it would be associated with very, very severe disruptions. And if it's compounded by his threat to remove undocumented workers, we'll see rapid increases in construction costs, in food costs, in services costs like elderly care and other care, compounding that, further increasing interest rates. So I think as long as the Fed remains independent, it's going to be very, very difficult in that environment to reduce interest rates and stimulate growth in the US. I also think that it's not Asia that's most vulnerable to tariffs, because actually 70% of Asian trade is within Asia. It's really certain countries like the UK, which are trying to diversify increasingly into the US market, and other commodity exporters that will be particularly vulnerable to a tariff war. So that is a big worry.
Bilal, why is Europe lagging behind both the US and China in terms of competitiveness? What does it need to do to catch up? Can it catch up, or is that battle already lost?
Well, there's a lot going on in Europe. I would say fundamentally, if we just focus on Germany, which is the largest economy within Europe and historically has been the sort of the leading, the engine for Europe. And what we see with Germany is that fundamentally, its whole business model, economic model has broken. So historically, its model was essentially to import cheap energy from Russia, manufacture diesel or petrol cars, and then export that to the rest of the world. And all parts of that business model has broken down. No longer do they have cheap energy. On top of that, Germany no longer is the dominant sort of car automaker in the world, in the sense that the world's moved on to electric cars, and Germany lags in that. So there's a fundamental reshape needed in the German economy. And so if Germany lags, then that will pull Europe down overall. So the task is quite large for Europe to do something. A key thing will be for them to think about cheaper energy sources. Another aspect of this is to shift the industrial focus of Europe, especially Germany, away from the traditional auto sector. Another aspect of this is that they'll need to think more about being more fiscally active in general, and link that to investment overall. And that's been a big challenge for the Europeans, as we've seen in the latter part of 2024, where the German government and the French government have fallen in different ways and have been unable to implement fiscal policies to what they had planned to. So they've got lots of challenges, and I think that 2025 will be an important test for Europe.
But Bilal, is the political will there to surmount these challenges?
It's a great question. I think that there is a will to try to improve the conditions of the economy overall. The challenge you have in all of these countries is that you really need a European-wide policy to make things really improve. Instead, what you're seeing on the political side is each country is moving inwards into itself. So there's more of an insular approach for each country, where there's infighting within France, within Germany, and so that means that there's a lack of a European vision, and that's a big problem. So I think, while there is a will for change in each country, the nature of that debate is such that it's preventing the most viable way for them to improve, which is a European-wide solution.
Deborah, how does Asia view Europe's sluggishness right now? What's the view from there?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have overall, and one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump's entry back into power in January is so dangerous, is that we have a global system that is really not in great shape either. We have very few political leaders in Asia or in Europe or anywhere, frankly, with the stature to push through potentially challenging domestic level reforms, let alone coordinate some kind of international consistent response, or at least even within a smaller group of countries. I think it's very hard to see who is going to be able to push for some kind of stabilizing measures, some kind of coordinated response. And I think that is a huge challenge. And it's not just about what Europe does or doesn't do. It's not just about what different Asian markets do or don't do. It's really a sort of global phenomenon. And that's what makes, I think, this period we're entering so problematic.
Ian, one final word on Europe here. What are the main challenges that you see for Europe going forward here? And with Donald Trump back in the White House, to what extent will all of us, not just Europe, but the whole world, have to work differently?
I think the first thing to say about Europe is that the economic model that Europeans have chosen is one which I think they're broadly comfortable with, which is relatively short working weeks, long holidays, and very strong social safety nets. Care, health, education, largely free in many countries. That model, of course, is what is behind relatively slower growth. So Europeans have made a trade-off that they want a way of life, they want a nature of the environment, a work-life balance, which is, I think, different to that in many other countries and of Asia and even in the US. And that drives, I think, an underlying level of lower growth than you'd have in other places. Whether that's sustainable, whether it'll have to change is the question. Of course, it's a source of immense political tension within countries. So I think it's likely to continue on that path. I think Europeans are broadly comfortable with the way of life they've chosen. And as a bigger share of the European economy is services which cannot really be speeded up by AI, like care, like hospitality, like leisure. We move from a world of manufacturing essentially to massages, meals, and medical care. Then you have very low probability of AI being the driver of very much more rapid growth. Tighter integration within Europe is absolutely key. The capital market integration, the sorts of things that Mario Draghi has recommended are necessary. And we are seeing that worked out. But I don't think that Europe will have a manufacturing revival of a major sort or a revival in its growth rates to well over 2%. I think we have to get comfortable in Europe. And it's a contracting workforce, a contracting population. So per capita income still increases if you only grow at 2%. And I think that's the future for Europe.
Okay, I'm going to ask you now to gaze into your crystal balls and give us your predictions for 2025. I know it's an impossible task, and I'm not going to hold you to anything that you say. Bilal, we haven't even discussed energy prices yet. Give us your view of what we can expect generally in 2025, and also, of course, pivotal to inflation, our energy prices. What's going to happen to those next year?
Well, I think on the energy price side, I actually think energy prices will be relatively stable over the course of 2025. Or if anything, I think there's a risk they could end up going lower over the course of the year. And that's mainly premised on if we look at the amount of supply that's coming on the market over the course of 2025 is relatively high. I also think there will be sluggish growth in some key economies, whether it's China or in Europe, so the demand will be less as well. And I also think while we do have the geopolitical tensions, my sense is that it won't necessarily escalate in a way that will disturb key oil producers.
Deborah, what's your view of 2025, particularly when it comes to Asian economies? Where will new sources of growth come from in 2025, or is this year set to be a pretty moribund one for Asian economies?
I'm losing audio. I think you were asking me about my 2025 prediction. Hopefully it's good on your end, yes. My audio. Technology is always, uneven, as we can see from my audio today. And so I do think that there are other challenges ahead besides those which we've talked about, including technology issues. Climate remains on the agenda despite all of this difficulties. We've seen unexpected physical battle conflict, cross-border conflict that is still a problem. Still having inequality. I mean, there's a number of things that are a challenge for 2025. And again, it is going to be a very unusual, very busy year.
But where in 2025 are new sources of growth going to come from, Deborah?
Well, that's a tough question, isn't it? I would love to say from lots of green shoots, it's going to be fantastic. But it is hard to see where the pockets of opportunity will be in 2025. I think because we're going to have such disruption and it's going to be happening so quickly. I'm not seeing this time around, at least with a Trump 2, where those growth opportunities will be for sure, because it's like an earthquake is hit, and now we have other earthquakes and other tsunamis, and we have to try to figure out how that all comes together to deliver opportunities in some places. And so identifying ahead of time where those will be is challenging, more challenging than normal.
I know Ian wants to come in on that one as well. Ian?
What one sees depends very much on where one stands. And my sense is that new growth is going to come from Asia. Growing at 5% on average a year is astoundingly good by historical comparisons. And many countries in Asia will be growing at more than that. So the answer is Asia. The sectoral answer, I think, is in certain areas of biotech, particularly medical devices, medicine, fantastic advances. There's terrific advances as well on renewables and energy. The price of energy is coming down dramatically on renewables and EVs. And I think we will see AI leading to very rapid advances in some other areas as well over the coming year. So I think it's going to be a bright year despite this reverberations of uncertainty. Not in the US. I think the uncertainties that Trump will generate are going to make it a very difficult investment environment. And I think Europe is also very uncertain. But if I was sitting in Asia, and I think to some extent were you sitting in the Gulf and Middle East, certainly the Emirates and Qatar part of the Middle East, I think it's a pretty bright future in 2025.
Ian, I've got about a minute left on the discussion. I just want to, we haven't discussed deglobalization at all. Do you see that trend continuing throughout 2025?
Yes, it's not so much deglobalization as a very rapid transformation of globalization, much more Asian globalization, so globalization alive and well in Asia. I see transformation, digital globalization is still going very fast. Investment flows in some regions are holding up, but we're certainly going to see a restructuring of globalization. And unfortunately, what we're seeing as well is a collapse of the globalization of cooperation. So multilateralism, the development of cooperative solutions to the risks we face is collapsing very rapidly. That means more risk, more systemic risk. Expect not only slower containment of climate change, but also pandemics, conflict, and other shocks. If you don't have cooperation, that risk rises very rapidly. So that's the most worrying aspect of the transformation of globalization.
And there we must end it. It's been fascinating. Wishing you all a happy, a healthy, and prosperous 2025. Thanks.